Okay, if you'll recall, we're studying the kingdom Protista, and within the kingdom Protista, more specifically, the fungus-like protists. And last time we were looking at the cellular slime molds, Acellular Mycota, and they're called cellular slime molds because they spend most of their life cycle as single cells, individual cells, just kind of crawling around in the soil. And if you were to see them in the soil, just like these amoeboid cells here, you would think that they might be amoeba, but they're not. They're slime molds. So here we're looking at acellular slime molds, and the acellular refers to the fact that most of their life cycle is not spent as individual cells. Most of their life cycle is spent aggregated together into this big thing that's been called a plasmodium. Not to be confused with the plasmodium that causes malaria. The protozoan, the sporozoan protozoan that causes malaria is also called plasmodium. So don't confuse those two terms. They're two completely different things. So this plasmodium is a bunch of amoeboid cells that have aggregated together to form this big multinucleated slimy thing that slimes around, crawls around until it finds some food to feed on, some decomposing organic material to feed on, and it will feed on it, just like fungus feeds on decomposing organic matter. So it's almost like one big supercell. There are no plasma membranes separating the individual cells from each other within this plasmodium. So it's an aggregation of individual amoeboid cells. They all come together, just like they do in cellular slime molds. But in cellular slime molds, they remain individual cells when they form the slug that they form. But in this case, the plasma membranes go away, and they become one big supercell, one big multinucleated supercell. And that's how they spend most of their time. So, again, cellular slime molds, the Mycetes, are single cells most of the time, but in the Myxomycetes here, Myxomycota, they spend most of their time as an aggregated super multinucleated plasmodium, and that's how they live and feed most of the time. Just like in the cellular slime molds, there's both sexual and asexual reproduction going on. Sexual fertilization is going on here, where two gametes, and notice that they don't look very different from each other at all. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart by looking at them like you can sperm and egg in us. But these are gametes, and they fuse together at fertilization. That's what fertilization always is the fusion of cells, and then ultimately the fusion of the nuclei in those cells to produce a zygote. And that's sexual reproduction. That's basically what sexual reproduction is. It involves the fusion of gametes or the fusion of nuclei from two cells that are haploid. The gametes have to be haploid. They have to have half the number of chromosomes. So you'll notice in the color coding here, we're in the haploid phase of the life cycle. But when they fuse, they form a diploid. That's what 2N means, right? Diploid, which means the full number of chromosomes. So it forms a diploid amoeboid zygote. So the life cycle, again, if you look at the color coding, the life cycle is mostly diploid because they spend most of their time in this multinucleated plasmodium. That's within the diploid part of the life cycle. So they're most of the time they are diploid, just like we are. Most of our bodies, or not most of them, all of our body cells are diploid except for our gametes. Sperm and egg are the only cells in our bodies that are haploid, have half the number of chromosomes. So mostly diploid, the life cycle, as opposed to the cellular slime molds on the previous slide, which are mostly haploid in their life cycle. They spend most of their time as with half the number of chromosomes. Oh, and by the way, that's the way that true fungi are too. So the plasmodium, again, is a multinucleated aggregation of cells that slimes around, finds food, feeds on that decaying and dead and decaying food, and in that way they act as decomposers, just like true fungi do. So that's their ecological role. But they mature, the plasmodium eventually matures, and that's what we're seeing going on here, and as it matures, it produces sporangia that asexually produce spores by the process of meiosis or meiosis. And remember that meiosis, the effect of meiosis is to reduce the number of chromosomes in half. So these spores then are, as you can see by the color coding, going back to being haploid. So we go from diploid back to haploid. The spores are haploid, one N, and then they germinate. Did that a little too soon. They germinate and give rise to new amoeboid cells and gametes that then can fuse, and the sexual life cycle starts all over again. All right, one more life cycle diagram, and this is the third phylum that is not a slime mold, not considered a slime mold. At least the common name is not slime mold. The common name is a water mold, Oomycota. And you'll see why it's called Oomycota in a minute. But Oomycetes, the common name for members of the phylum Oomycota, they're known as water molds because they live in water or very wet conditions. Some are terrestrial plant parasites, for example, potato blight. And we'll come back to that on the next slide. But, you know, so they infect our crops, which is a problem. Like true fungi, you know, because these are fungus-like protists, the Oomycetes have cell walls. So true fungi have cell walls, and when we study fungi, you'll learn that. They have cell walls. And like true fungi, the Oomycetes form multinucleated filaments called hyphae. So this is showing a hyphae, a filament coming out of a germinating spore. So a hyphae is a filament of a fungus, or in this case, an Oomycete. Again, when we study fungi, you'll learn that true fungi have hyphae. So you're going to learn about that term again. So this is the first time you're hearing it. You'll hear it again when we study fungi. The hyphae then grow and branch, and that's what we're seeing in the diagram here. They grow and branch into this tangled mat, eventually a lot of hyphae all tangled together, and we call that structure a mycelium. And again, this is something that we see in true fungi too. They form a mycelium. The fungal body is basically made up of this tangled mat of hyphae that we call a mycelium. So those are characteristics they share with true fungi, but what makes them different than true fungi. So in other words, unlike true fungi, their life cycle is mostly diploid. So again, like on the previous slide, I pointed out that true fungi, their life cycle is mostly haploid. So in the Oomycetes here, their life cycle is mostly diploid, as you can see from the color coding in the diagram. And their cell walls are made out of something different than the cell walls of true fungi. The cell walls of Oomycetes are made of cellulose, not chitin. True fungi, their cell walls are made out of chitin, this material called chitin. And again, you'll learn that again when we study fungi. But in Oomycetes, their cell walls are made out of cellulose, which is the same material that makes up plant cell walls, interestingly enough. So, and they produce flagellated zoospores because they exist in water. They're water molds, right? So these zoospores have flagella so that they can swim in water. So these aren't spores that are specialized to blow in the wind and disperse in the wind. They're spores that are specialized to swim in the water, to disperse in water. So they need flagella to be able to do that. So their life cycle is mostly diploid, just like we saw in the previous slide for the acellular slime molds. And they reproduce both sexually and asexually, and in their asexual reproduction, which is what we're seeing going across the middle of the diagram here, they produce flagellated zoospores from specialized zoosporangia. And by the way, they are putting zoo on the front of these, or zoo, because these are animal-like spores. Because they have flagella, they're animal-like, just like the animal-like protists, the flagellated animal-like protists. So that's why they're calling them zoospores here. So zoosporangia, which are specialized hyphae, produce flagellated spores that we call zoospores. And then those zoospores germinate, and that's what we're seeing happening here, and give rise to hyphae that feed and grow and branch into eventually a big tangled mat that we call a mycelium. And you'll see an example of what a mycelium looks like on the next slide, but I'm sure you've seen fungal mycelia, like when you see mold growing, you're seeing mycelium, like the white stuff all over a strawberry that has got mold growing on it. That's mycelium. So again, they germinate, give rise to hyphae. The hyphae grows and branches into eventually a mycelium. Sexual reproduction is completely different than what we see in the slime molds. In oomycetes, and this is the whole reason they're known as oomycetes, sexual reproduction involves haploid male nuclei forming within specialized hyphae called an antheridium. So there's a specialized hyphae, antheridia, just like we have specialized hyphae that forms oosporangia for asexual reproduction. There are specialized hyphae that form this thing called an antheridium, where male nuclei, haploid male nuclei, form. And then there's an oogonium that female nuclei form in, and they both form by the process of meiosis. So they both form from diploid cells into haploid cells by the process of meiosis. Those nuclei come from diploid nuclei that undergo meiosis to form haploid nuclei. And so those, in the female reproductive structure, the oogonium, those cells would be considered eggs. And the technical name for eggs is oocyte. And so that's why these things are called Oomycota, because they form eggs, known as oocytes. And those eggs get fertilized. And fertilization, just like when a sperm fertilizes an egg, the real fertilization is when the sperm nucleus fuses with the egg nucleus. We see the same thing going on here, where the male nuclei will fuse with the female nuclei, and that's fertilization to form diploid spores. And those diploid spores, those diploid zygote spores, are going to germinate and give rise to new hyphae. So again, just like always, fertilization is the fusion of two haploid nuclei to produce a diploid zygote, to produce diploid zygote nuclei, and in this case, those are individual spores that can then germinate and give rise to mycelium, and the whole thing starts all over again. And notice that this just came up too, spores. So these are spores. So just like true fungi, these fungus-like protists, the slime molds and the water molds, their ecological role is to decompose. And they decompose, just like true fungi do, by feeding on and decomposing whatever they're growing on or in. So when you see a fungus growing, like you go walking in the woods and you see a fungus growing on something, or you pull out food from your refrigerator, or open a loaf of bread and see fungus growing on that bread, that's what it's feeding on. It's eating the bread, or it's eating the strawberries, or it's eating the bark or the wood, or the organic material in the soil, as in this case, or the potato in this case, or this bug that has either fallen into the water or is an aquatic arthropod and is dead. So there's a dead bug in the water there. So they're decomposers. Slime molds, these are examples of slime molds. And then this is an example of a water mold, and as I mentioned on the previous slide, this is the mycelia. All these hyphae here, these strands or filaments, that tangled mat of hyphae that's growing all over and through, it's growing into this insect as it's being decomposed by the water mold. All of that is what's known as mycelium. So this tangled mat of hyphae all over this insect is a mycelium. Some water molds are plant pathogens, for example, downy mildew in grapes, but also potato blight, and that's what we're seeing here. This is what potato blight looks like on the leaves of potatoes, and then it also infects the potatoes themselves. And that's what caused the potato famine of Ireland in 1845, because it rained. These are water molds, so they can grow in the water, but they can also grow when it's really, really wet. And they had a lot of rain in 1845, I guess, and that allowed for potato blight to infect the potato crops, and it wiped out potato crops so that Irish people were starving. And a lot of people then moved to the United States, for example. So if you have Irish ancestry, it's possible that your ancestors moved here from Ireland during that time because a lot of people were starving in Ireland. Remember, these water molds can reproduce asexually, and that's what we're seeing in this image. This is a zoosporangium, and we're seeing it at 4 different times. So you'll notice that something's coming out of the bottom of the zoosporangia here, and that would be a zoospore. So we're looking at a zoosporangium and a zoospore that's being produced from the zoosporangium. Well, the zoosporangium is basically full of zoospores. We're just seeing one actually coming out of the zoosporangium here in this image. So that's it for the fungus-like protists, the water molds, the slime molds. Next we move on to the plant-like protists, also known as algae.